If I start wandering around, I'm a stage walker, so if I start wandering away from the microphone, just yell at me or throw something at me, or I'll try and stay by the microphone. So today we're going to talk a bit about the historical context of why you're all here, the historical context of how soldiers became missing in action, and what was done, the accounting effort to try and recover unresolved casualties. And that's a pretty long history, a pretty intensive history. And a lot of that happened before DPAA was ever a thing, or before there was ever really an accounting mission. So we're going to talk a bit about DPAA and the research that all of us do, and then the ways that we incorporate that research and how it actually functionally works in everything that we do at DPAA. So one of the benefits that we've got being part of the research staff, first of all, I always joke that we're like the biggest history department in America. Just with the Indo-Pacific Directorate alone, we employ about 80 historians, historical anthropologists, historical archaeologists, and people who spend all of their time researching your cases. And that doesn't even count the people who work in the Europe Mediterranean Directorate. So a lot of people. And we have our hand in a bit of everything. You might have noticed that the people who were talking to you today about your cases are mostly historians. The people who are helping with conducting, researching, and conducting field investigations are historians. People writing research products to drive investigations, to drive recoveries, to drive disinterments are done by historians. So we're very proud to have that much of a hand in everything that the agency is doing. So we can start with our historical problem. As you can see on the top, over 405,000 Americans lost their lives during the Second World War, and 360,000 of them occurred overseas. So there's a big slice of that pie, the 77% that are recovered and identified. That's pretty amazing considering the Second World War was a really big moment for remains repatriation, for the accounting mission. This had never been done before, where the United States was going to recover the remains, or attempt to recover the remains of all of its service members, and even bring them back to the United States to be buried wherever their families wanted to. Previously, the best you were going to get from the First World War was a burial or a memorial marker in France somewhere, and the government footed the bill for soldiers and Marines' mothers to come and visit their graves. So this was a massive, massive undertaking in the 40s. 77% was pretty good, but that left us with that 21%, because you have 2% buried at sea. For the Navy, a sailor that goes down with the ship, that is an honored burial, that is their burial ground, and they are accounted for. But that 21% is still a big chunk, and that means that what we're dealing with right from the get-go is the low-hanging fruit is gone. 77%, that's the low-hanging fruit. Everything we're dealing with is something that somebody else has failed to do in the past. So it's a pretty unique challenge right out the gate. To give you the historical context, so you hear us kind of generically throw around the term graves registration. That means a few different things. So you have organic graves registration, which is generally Army units, Marine units, combat organizations in the field had graves registration. They had soldiers or personnel whose job, their sole job, was to locate and recover and make field expedient identifications of remains. And that was challenging, not just because of how many people were being killed during the war, but the fact that a lot of the times when they're doing this work, the fighting is still going on around them. The battlefield is dangerous, not just necessarily from combat, but you take a lot of these places in the South Pacific are just dangerous places to be. The environment is dangerous. or if you're working out in Belgium in the middle of the winter and you're worrying about getting frostbite, there's a lot of environmental factors that go into that. And yet they still did the best that they could and recovered quite a few American personnel in the field. After the war, the Return of the Dead program was really that innovative period where the US military, the War Department, really tried to do better than it did during the First World War. And so the Army Office of the Quartermaster General created two organizations, the American Graves Registration Service and the American Graves Registration Command. They are very, very similar organizations with different geographic focus. So since I work in the Indo-Pacific Directorate, we're going to use the generic American Graves Registration Service because those are the guys working out in the Pacific. And it was the responsibility of the AGRC and AGRS to repatriate or to recover all those remains in the field and attempt to identify them. This is a really interesting graphic because, as you can see, the icons, the crosses on there represent cemeteries, but the very obvious thing that you notice right off the bat is they're all different sizes, right? And the reason for this is, say when you have a battle that's happening in the field, the way that a lot of these cemeteries started is because 3 Marines might get killed in one particular place after an ambush and are buried in that space. The following day, a few more Marines are killed, and their graves registration Marines are saying, well, we buried the guys from yesterday over here, so bury them over there. And after a few days, you've got a few dozen Marines buried there. And that becomes 5th Marine Regiment Cemetery. And as the war progressed, as the battlefield became more secure, those cemeteries are consolidated into bigger cemeteries. The 5th Marine Regiment, the 1st Marine Regiment Cemetery becomes the 1st Marine Division Cemetery, and so on and so forth as the war is proceeding. Afterwards, when the AGRS and the AGRC are doing their work, all of those cemeteries scattered across Europe and scattered across the Pacific are being again consolidated into much bigger cemeteries. So you get to the point in the Pacific where in 1948, 1949, all of those tiny little cemeteries across the Pacific are in 5 massive cemeteries in Finschhafen in New Guinea, and eventually repatriated, exhumed, and moved again to the U.S. Cemetery in Manila in the Philippines. So it's a pretty significant undertaking. So you think by the time that a burial actually, whether it's identified or unidentified, reaches its final resting place where it is now, and a lot of these cases is in Manila, these remains from the time that this individual was killed have been buried and exhumed and buried and exhumed and buried and exhumed, each time undergoing some kind of analysis to try and figure out who this person is. So with that in mind, you can imagine where mistakes start to happen along the way, especially considering all those elements we talked about with battlefield conditions and the environment and the general chaos of moving millions of people around the globe to fight a war. So there's that to frame the historical problem for you, for what it is that we do and what it is that we're offering. We deal with 2 essential historical problems. We're trying to understand what happened to an individual or a set of individuals. What happened during this battle? What happened to this aircraft? We're understanding a historical event, right? In addition to that, so that falls into under the umbrella of kind of the military operational history. In order to find the guys who were killed on Guadalcanal, we have to understand what happened militarily on Guadalcanal, right? In addition to that, we need to understand the history of the accounting mission. which means understanding what the AGRS and the AGRC and the graves registration units were doing. And in some ways, that's even more challenging, because what we're trying to find is, again, what did these guys do wrong? What is it that we can actually manage to do that these very professional and skilled people back in the 40s couldn't do? So that's the starting point for us, is there's a problem that hasn't had a solution for almost 80 years. And what we try and do here is take approach through historical records, through other discoveries by other means, and implementing new technology, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth. But for us, for the historians, it all starts in the archives. It all starts with the individual deceased personnel files that you've got. That record, which we'll talk about more, is a summation of everything that's been done up until 1951 to account for your loved one. I mentioned to a family earlier that one of the biggest changes between the First World War and the Second World War, what do you think is something that might have made that process of combing the archives more challenging for someone researching World War II versus somebody researching World War I? So one of the Guadalcanal families, isn't it? Yeah. Carbon copy. The invention of carbon copy means that every report made by somebody during the Second World War has got 3 or 4 copies of it. That's great when we're looking for, when we're trying to make sure that records survived, so that if one copy gets destroyed, we still have another one. But that means that we have 4, 5, 6 times the volume of information to try and sort through than from previous conflicts. So, and not to mention, we've got this at various different repositories. We've got the National Archives out in College Park, Maryland. We've got the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, all the presidential libraries, the Air Force Historical Records Agency in Montgomery, Alabama. We have archives outside of the United States. Think of a lot of places like Burma and India and Malaysia. All of those during the Second World War were British colonies. So in addition to the American graves registration, the British War Graves registration was conducting remains recovery in those areas. And when they find a set of remains and they don't know whether they're British, there's a good chance they don't know who they are at all. So those are additional records for us to consult. And then of course we have information that comes from all of you. When you bring photos, when you bring letters, all of these little pieces of information go into the whole mosaic of us trying to reconstruct this episode. I was mentioning to a group of families earlier that what we're really trying to do is, instead of thinking about the loss of your loved one is just like a linear episode that happened. So we really want to understand what happened. We're looking at the history of a specific space because we need to know not just what happened to that aircraft or that person, but what happened in that space since then. What has been built there? What has been built? What has been destroyed? What has changed? And how does that affect all of our research and our field operations? And it's complicated, but it's also that's why all of us work here, because it's something that we all find very interesting and rewarding. One of the other challenges that we faced is the fire at the National Personnel Records Center in 1973. Some of you have probably obtained official military personnel files. That's the whole service record from everything that your loved one got from their initial physical, their immunizations, their marksmanship achievements, all the awards they got. If you have an Army casualty who served between 1912 and 1960, there's a really good chance that their record was destroyed in the 70s. So that has been a challenge for us. kind of starting off with exactly those records. I know I already mentioned these, but the starting points for us when we are, our connection to DPAA's mission is through individuals. We might be looking at we might be working in project spaces and working with different countries, but on a fundamental level, we come to events like this and we talk to each of you about an individual, because a lot of what we're doing, in addition to the finite part of resolving a casualty, of bringing closure, is we're trying to tell stories. Because the difference between a service member who served and came home, or even a service member who was killed and identified, is that their story has context. Their story makes sense. Somebody knows what happened to them. For these missing service members, their story is incomplete. So even as far as those guys who were, the difference between a missing individual and an individual who got to come home and have everybody in his community tell him what a great job he did in the war, that's something that these people were denied. And so on that, dealing with this on a personal level like that, are these two types of records. The official military personnel file, the OMPF, which is everything, the whole record of military service. Some of those are long, some of them are short. The longest OMPFs I've seen have been about 600 pages long, and the shortest one's about 20. A lot of those were young men who enlisted in the Navy in the summer of 1941 and got killed at Pearl Harbor, have very short OMPFs. The individual deceased personnel file is every individual who was killed in action, regardless of whether they were recovered or not, has a record, an IDPF, that accounts for everything that the War Department understands about their loss, where they went missing, witness statements to their disappearance or to their death, missing aircrew reports, unit diaries, and in addition to that, everything that was done immediately after to account for their remains. So you might find area search records from AGRS groups in there. And beyond that, you also have things like when the War Department has to try and figure out what to do with the service members' personal effects. They have a foot locker with all of their stuff in it. So they're contacting family members. One of the best things about IDPFs is periodically when you get them, and if you don't have your IDPF, talk to your service casualty officer. We have all of the IDPFs, we can get you them. One of the best things that pop up is you will periodically find letters from your family members who are writing the War Department. So somebody will open up an IDPF and say, oh, that's my grandmother's handwriting. She's asking the War Department what happened to her son. So they're very interesting documents, but they're incredibly useful to us. And I'll mention that the IDPFs are also, we're interested in the ones that come from resolved casualties as well. Because imagine if you have a platoon of soldiers who are ambushed and a bunch of them are killed. Some of them are recovered, some of them are not. An IDPF for a resolved individual is going to tell us a lot about how that individual was recovered, up to and sometimes including a grid coordinate for where their body was found, which is incredibly useful when we're trying to reconstruct the context of a particular event. We can get a better idea of where that ambush took place if we know where these other guys' bodies were found. And kind of in the same vein, other military records, using the ground loss example, a lot of units kept daily journals on the battalion level, on the regimental level. Shout out to the Marines, they kept some. They're a much smaller organization in the Army. Some of the Marines records were really excellent. They were kept on a very micro level, especially as you get later into the Second World War on the later campaigns. And morning reports, most of the time, and I say most of the time because sometimes there are circumstances that prevent accurate record keeping in combat. there's a lot going on. But morning reports, muster is supposed to be taken every day to get an accountability of who's there and who isn't there, and more importantly, tell you why they're not there if they're unaccounted for. Is this person on sick call? Was this person out on the line last night and now they're just missing? A lot of cases we have are things like that where a service member just exists one day in the unit and the next day nobody knows where he is. And that's the starting point that we have. For air losses, missing aircrew reports. This is an interesting area because the missing aircrew report, or the MACR, a lot of you, if you have an air loss, you probably heard us refer to it as MACR and then a sequence of numbers. Not all air units wrote MACRs. For instance, Navy air losses did not produce MACR reports. They were exclusively Army Air Corps, Army Air Forces things. And like most other records, the record keeping got better as the war went on. So in a lot of these early war instances, the records are not as comprehensive as they are later on. Some of the other things that this is the part that I really geek out about with our work. Trying to use documents that were created in the past in ways that they couldn't is a really interesting component of our research. So this is a really great example of, we have a map from Guadalcanal, and this map shows us the disposition of a particular battalion. So you can see all the A company, B company, C company, and it tells you where they are. And then up here, it tells you, it doesn't show you all of the grid squares on the map, but it shows you the intersection of a particular two. And this is on like a tracing paper. So the idea was that you could take this overlay and lay it over the map and understand where that was. The problem with that is sometimes we don't have or can't find the map sheet that was used, especially with something like Guadalcanal, where it's an early war battle. You might go to a one battalion of the 5th Marine Regiment, and they're using a different map sheet than another battalion in their same regiment. This is where the improvements as the war goes on make things easier on the units fighting in these battles, and consequently make things easier for us now. So not necessarily being able to use this document as it stands is a challenge. It makes things harder for us. So, but what do we have that the AGRS didn't have? We've got all of this geospatial data. We have GIS, we have Google Earth. We have all of these things that can help us to take that piece of information and bring it to life in a different way. So now we can, instead of just trying to rectify that against a map, we can now take this map of these positions and actually point to specific grid coordinates on the ground and say that based on this map, this is exactly where on the ground in Guadalcanal these guys were. And then once we get out there, we're looking for things like evidence of fighting positions, we're looking for foxholes, we're looking for ammunition casings, all of the different things that show you that a battle was there. So it's a piece of the whole puzzle for us. Another great example of that is, this is an image from Italy. As you can imagine, the Air Forces in World War II took a ton of images of good example, this is from Italy. So this is the Allied bombing campaign in Europe. Is taking photographs of everything, always determining the targets for the next upcoming bomb missions or surveillance photography. And this is what happens when when a plane crashes in the ground, that it leaves evidence behind. It leaves scarring in the ground, it leaves an impact crater. So what we can do is, if we know that an aircraft crashed one day, we can go back and try and find an image from before that day, and then try and find an image from later on, after the incident, and compare those two things and find anomalies in there, like this, which is very clearly different than what the ground looked like right there before the date of this incident. And this is a case where we sent a recovery team to this location, and we found remains there. We found a crash site, and we identified those remains. So a lot of the legwork for historians, the puzzle that we're putting back together is trying to find missing pieces. It's not like we have the puzzle and we just need to put it back together. It's like having a puzzle where half the pieces are missing, and you have to figure out what they looked like. So we might have this type of information for this case, and then you look for another incident, and it is the place where, sure enough, not a single reconnaissance photograph was ever taken of that space during the entire war, and that's frustrating. But that just means that we have to try and find another angle, another way of looking at this case in order to advance it and get us to the point of field work. I want to take a few minutes to sit on this slide because historical research in the field is such a big topic for us, but there's one slide for it. So I mentioned earlier that the historians that you're talking to here are people who are not just doing historical research, they're communicating their research to families, and they're doing the field investigations themselves. Michelle over here was on Iwo Jima earlier this year. I was in China and Papua New Guinea earlier this year. Well, Drew's not here anymore. He was in the back of the room, but he was out in Papua New Guinea earlier this year. I don't know what the EM guys were doing, Mark, so I'll let you speak to that later. But all the people you're talking to now are seeing this process through, and it's not just a process of putting something together and we follow it through to field work and then that's the end of it. Once we get into the field, that's just another opportunity for us to gather more evidence. So your historians are your consistency in field work and investigation as well, because we're the same ones, people going back to the same places over and over again. We're developing networks of contacts, people who, as you can imagine, when something happened 80 years ago, we might go talk to somebody in a particular place in Palau, and they say, yeah, we've never heard anything. We don't know about anything that happened here. We know there was a battle, sorry. And then we come back 6 months later, and the guy that we spoke to said, hey, I talked to my neighbors, and I talked to this other guy, and I met up with my cousin who I haven't seen in a year, and they've all got a bunch of information for you. So it's just another source of information for us to put back into that puzzle. And one of the other ones that is kind of is an incredibly important part of what we do, that is archival material that exists outside of the archives, is aircraft wreckage. The amount of time that our research staff put into understanding how an aircraft was built and then what that aircraft looks like after it was blown into a million pieces accounts for a lot of our time. It's fascinating work, and understanding the difference between, I guess to give you an example, if we are looking for, if we're following up on a lead where these people that we've met out in the field give us information where they say we believe that there's an aircraft, a plane crashed over here, the elders in the village say that this crashed, I think it crashed in early 1944, and we're gonna go check it out. The first thing we wanna do is try and determine, is this an airplane, or is this somebody's lawnmower that was left out there and it's just rusted metal? So we can use aircraft parts manuals, we can use photographs of aircraft to say, no kidding, that is, you know, a piece of landing gear from an aircraft. And from there, we're looking for parts manufacturer stamps, inspector marks, serial numbers, the things that can go from telling us that this is an aircraft to saying that this is a 4-engine bomber to saying that this is a B-24 to a B-24J to a specific serial number. Because once we get down to that point where we know which actual aircraft this is, which serialized aircraft rolled off of the assembly line, a consolidated aircraft, we can determine then through missing aircrew reports, through all the things that we just talked about, who was on that aircraft at the time that it crashed. And we know at that point, are any of the crew members missing? Were they all resolved during the war? And that's good information regardless, because an aircraft that doesn't have any remains on it is a good data point for us. That makes sure that the next time we have money to go out to Papua New Guinea to look for an aircraft, we're not going to waste our time looking at that one, because we know none of your family members are there. And then all this information that we gather during field activities, we come back, we write our reports. Just like everything else, we peer review with one another. We ask one another questions to try and make sure that we're capturing as much of this as possible. And then we integrate all of that back into the research that we were doing. So it's cyclical. Every time we go back to the archives, every time we go back to the field, we're getting more information that gets ingested into your case file. That's the information and turns into the case summaries that you have now, that turn into the case narratives that determine the proposals to get field work done, to get disinterments done. Disinterments are the other big thing here. The two, I know a bunch of you have sat through a lot of the other briefings, and some of the things I'm telling you are going to be a little bit stuff that you've heard earlier on today. But the two main ways that DPAA accounts for unresolved service members is through remains that are recovered in the field and through disinterments of X files. Just like the IDPF is the whole record of a deceased personnel, the X file is the whole record of an unidentified set of remains. It'll tell you where the remains were found, it will tell you what condition they were in, it will tell you how many times they've been looked at by an anthropologist, they'll tell you how many teeth were intact, everything you'd want to know, an estimated stature, ethnicity, all kinds of things about a set of remains that we are interested in. And a huge part of the identifications that we make come from disinterments. And that means that we have created enough of a research, generated enough research about this set of remains that we've been able to create a list of people that, all the people that we think could historically be associated with that set of remains. So if we find a set of an X file that came from France, sure enough, the guy who was killed on Okinawa is not on the short list there. So this is the product of our exhaustive research to make that list as short and refined as possible. Because what we need to do is, I thought this was on this slide. Once we make that short list and we create a disinterment memo and that gets through the whole process, that list of individuals that we think might be associated with that X file, we have to reach a threshold of 50% FRS, family reference samples, in order to have that disinterment approved. So if we're looking at X25 from Manila, here's our short list, there are 45 guys on it. We need to have 50% of those individuals with DNA from one of you on file before we can get the approval to exhume those remains. That threshold goes up if we have a group burial. So in a lot of cases, when the AGRS finds a bunch of remains from an air crash or from a battlefield that are all commingled, and they just collected them all, they couldn't tell how many people are represented, and they put them all in one grave, and all we know is it's commingled. So our short list gets much bigger, and now the threshold, because we know there's more than one individual, we need 60% of that short list in order to get those remains out of the ground. This is just a breakdown here of our unknowns between the Indo-Pacific and the Europe-Mediterranean areas. The cemeteries that we work in, I'll use the Pacific as the example. Our disinterments are generally coming from one of two cemeteries. One of them is the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, or the Punch Bowl, which is in Honolulu. And the other one is the National Cemetery in Manila in the Philippines. The difference between these is any cemetery that is inside the United States is like Arlington National Cemetery or like the Punch Bowl, or even some of your local smaller national cemeteries are administered by the Department of Veterans Affairs. Any cemetery outside of the United States that houses American remains is administered by the American Battle Monuments Commission. So we have to work with different organizations to get the right permissions. We get the permission through the Department of Defense to proceed with a disinterment. It doesn't mean we just get to walk into a cemetery and start digging up graves. We still need to work with the cemetery administration. We still need to work with the host nation if there is one in that case. And it's a long and complicated process. I wrote my first disinterment memo in 2018, and those remains came out of the ground just last month. So it's a long process, but again, it is the means by which we are making the majority of our identifications. So this whole process for disinterments, again, just like we talked about the battlefield recoveries and how complicated that was for the AGRS, the AGRC. Identification of remains in the days before DNA was a complex matter. And so this whole process of, like I mentioned earlier, when the remains are buried on a battlefield and exhumed and moved to a bigger cemetery and subsequent cemeteries until they wind up in the Punch Bowl, every time the remains come out of the ground, they're undergoing some kind of forensic analysis. They're having anthropologists look at them, compare their records against the ones compiled into IDPFs. They're trying to figure out, well, this set of remains has a gold crown on one of its teeth. Which of these guys had a gold crown? And getting through all of that until they've reached some of these individuals that they just do not have the information to make a conclusive identification. In some of the cases in your IDPFs, you'll see that there was an association at some point. X25 was at some point, someone said, this could be your family member, but then they got to the point where they said, there's not enough dental on record, or there's no dentition with this set of remains, and there's just not enough information to make a conclusive identification based off of their metric at the time. So a lot of these remains went through various courses of analysis, and the reason why the threshold is so high is because after all of this process, these remains are in honored graves in cemeteries, have been buried under military honors, and we want to know that if we are going to disturb those graves again and bring them into our lab, and that we have a more than decent chance of identifying them, which is why so much historical analysis goes into them, which is why so much lab analysis goes into it once the remains come up, and why so much lab analysis goes into the disinterment memo as well. I want to emphasize that I'm really, really hyping up the role that the historians, the research staff do here, because, you know, they're my people, and we've got a really fantastic research staff here. But everything we do is interdisciplinary. Everything we do is collaborative. When we write an investigation proposal to investigate a site in the South Pacific, the historians are going to write it, and then the lab is going to take a tack at it, and then a few different people from each of those directorates are going to have input and say in what goes in there, and ask questions and make sure we're developing the best product possible to increase our chances of recovering and identifying remains. So it really is truly a collaborative process. I kind of already got to this a little bit about why remains are unidentifiable. That word unidentifiable came about usually in 1950 or 1951 when the War Department determined that everything possible was done within the left and right limits of what they could do at that time. Everything had been done to identify those remains, and they failed to make a conclusive identification. All those remains at that point were deemed unidentifiable. Right around the same time that remains were determined unidentifiable, all missing service personnel who had not been recovered were deemed non-recoverable. So these things, the conclusion of this process, in at least the initial process from the 50s, from World War II, happened in the 50s, and it wasn't so much until the Reagan era where the accounting mission started to gain public importance and significance in the public eye again. So I'm going to breeze through a couple of these a little bit because we've kind of hit on it already. What's our strategy? Our strategy for everything that we do to maximize our results is sustained, continuous, interdisciplinary research. Every single one of these cases, at no point are we ever going to stop and look at your family member on a list and say, nope, we tried everything that we can. That doesn't happen here. That's something that happened in the back in the 50s, but every single thing that we do can be improved and reassessed through additional information that we gain, whether it's through archival research or field work or forensic analysis. All of these things help these case portfolios get more refined over time. And one big piece of data that goes into that is every time that we make an identification, that's another piece of information that goes back into the whole cycle. If we know that if we identified a particular individual from a plane crash that we couldn't correlate in the field, but we found that person and we identified them, then we suddenly know that we have the right plane crash, and that there's a good chance that the other unaccounted for crew members from that plane crash are back on that site. Or if we found a member of A Company, 5th Marines, at a particular place on Guadalcanal, there's a better chance that other members of that company might be found in that same general vicinity. It's a piece of information we didn't have earlier. And our goal for disinterments is to make the best recommendations we can to meet or exceed DoD disinterment thresholds. We're trying to do as many of these as we can responsibly within our legal mandate, because we do have such an outsized number of identifications that come from disinterments. We talked a little bit about the short list already. It starts with our research, building that short list. We're responsible for trying to say all of these individuals could be our guy for this X file. We don't make cuts to that list. The lab can start to make cuts based off of stature, and then making additional cuts based off of DNA analysis, and all the things that the lab has told you about earlier today. And the idea is that with all the information that we have, that we can first get the remains out of the ground by meeting that FRS threshold, and do so in a way that we maximized our opportunity to make an identification. This is our chart for disinterments. A few notable things here. So as I mentioned, this wasn't a big deal. I should say it wasn't a big priority for us. It was something that we wanted to do, but didn't have a government mandated, an agreed upon way within the Department of Defense to do this until 2015, where you see that first big spike on there when we started the USS Oklahoma project to identify the 406 missing crew members from the USS Oklahoma, which sank at Pearl Harbor. That was where we got that federal mandate to determine the FRS threshold and gave us a path forward for how to do this. Out of that, the 406 sailors and Marines who were on the Oklahoma, I don't remember the exact number, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 385 that we actually identified. It was a tremendously successful program for us. And as you can see, because of that, more disinterments happen later on. So the next big spike there is in 2019. This is when we started our Korean War identification project. Same thing happened where we started to exhume all of the Korean War unknowns from the Punch Bowl Cemetery. And then you can, of course, see the biggest one here in 2023 when we started, we exhumed the remains from the Enora Maru, from the Hell ship. For those of you who are not familiar with that one, from a Japanese troop transport that was carrying American POWs that was sunk by a US submarine. That was our latest massive disinterment project. So this is incredibly important to making sure that we are getting identifications. It's not more important than the field work. A lot of that is dependent on the location. Some places we have better luck finding remains. Papua New Guinea, we have great success finding remains in Papua New Guinea. We don't have great success finding remains in the field in Korea. The inverse of that is, from Korea, we have incredible success finding or getting identifications through disinterments, more so than we do in Papua New Guinea. So it's maximizing our efforts across different geographic spaces to try and get results for all of you in the best way that we can with the resources allocated to us. So how can you support? First of all, you're here. This is really a crowdsourced type of project for us. When you think of the Department of Defense, it's like, the biggest bureaucracy in the world. We're a very, very small part of the Department of Defense, and we are here because you are here. So every time that you share a story about coming to an FMU, every time that you attend one of these events, we're getting more publicity. We're getting more eyes on the work that we do. That means more participation. That means more historical sources that come our way. Like I said, when you share stuff that you bring here, that gets more FRS samples to help us meet FRS thresholds to make identifications. So bringing whatever you have. Like I said, we're an organization that tells stories. We are trying to ultimately, yes, there is the tangible part of trying to bring your family member home to have an honorable burial where their family wants them, like they deserve. But there's also just that component of being able to better tell the story of somebody who served and sacrificed for their country when they were asked to. And so anything that you can bring in to show us, to share with us even if it doesn't go right into a case narrative, these events are real gut check moments for us too. We're working on this stuff all the time. I've told a few people today that if you walked around any of our office spaces to where the historians live, all of the photographs that you bring in are photocopied and are up on the wall. This means a lot to us. It means a lot to see all of you and speak with all of you and hear your stories. In a more tangible way, we have, for photographs, extra bonus. If you have a photograph where your loved one is smiling and showing their teeth, my family wouldn't, I'm not a tooth smiler, so it wouldn't work. But we've been able to help assist in identifications through using dentition because an individual decided to show their pearly whites in one of their photos. And so the parting advice that I have, the request that I have of all of you is to stay involved. Tell other people that you know about this. Keep your families involved. Keep your kids involved. It's important work. If it wasn't important work, all of us wouldn't be here right now, spending our Saturday talking about it and trying to find solutions to a really challenging historical problem. So I just want to end by thanking you for all of your time, all of your commitment, for your family's sacrifice. And like I said, we have another big Q&A in 25 minutes, but I'm happy to stay up here as long as you like and answer whatever questions you've got. Thank you very much for your time. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the FRS threshold, and I probably paged out while you were explaining it. But what are the components of the FRS threshold?
What do you mean by the components of it?
Well, I think the threshold was like 50%.
Correct.
What goes into, that's 50% of what?
It's 50% of the, once we've created the disinterment memo, which is the historically infused research document that is going to lead to a disinterment, the list of individuals that we put on that, so all the people that we think might historically make sense with this X file, we have to have an FRS sample for 50% of the individuals on that list. So if we have well, yes, correct. There are various different types of DNA sequences, of DNA types that we're trying to collect, but we need to just have one of those types of DNA on file to meet that threshold for that individual. Thank you, Aylwin. So again, if we have 100 people on that short list, and we have DNA reference samples for 49 of them, then that disinterment memo is staying on hold until we get one more person, and then we can proceed with that disinterment. So again, that goes back to talking to, sharing your experiences, networking with other families. Thank you for that question, sir. Yes, ma'am.
To your knowledge, has there ever been a partnership between the U.S. government and the Japanese government? To your knowledge, has there ever been a partnership between the U.S. government and the Japanese government in combining forces to recover both casualties? Like if you're talking about the Philippine Sea or near Saipan or someplace where we know there are massive casualties on both sides, has there ever been an effort for us to join forces because it'll benefit everybody on both sides?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is yes and no. So currently, the Japanese government does remains recovery work in many of the same places that we do. And while we don't have currently, in some countries, we have like a memorandum of understanding, a memorandum of agreement, like a formal agreement with that country that we are doing specific things to aid one another. With the Japanese version of DPAA, we don't have a formal agreement with them right now. But we do work with them pretty closely. That's one of the things that I actually, during one of our last staff trips to Papua New Guinea, we were there the same time as a Japanese delegation was. And that was part of the discussion that we had, was trying to figure out how we can create some kind of agreement together. As you can imagine, especially with big giant governments like the United States and Japan, those types of things take a little bit of time. But we do share information a lot. With whenever we legally can, and we collaborate on, or we let them know, a lot of cases where we're going. Places like the Solomon Islands, Palau, Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, we have a lot of overlap. And the reality is that anywhere that there are missing Americans remains, there are probably Japanese remains there as well. So short answer is yes, we work with Japan, and we are trying to do more with them going forward. I had another question back here.
Two questions, actually. The first one is, you stated in 2018 you started to pursue a disinterment, and you just recently got the permission for it. What is causing it to take so long?
That's a great question, and the answer to that is the FRS threshold. We can, and we do. We have historians at DPAA whose entire jobs, for the most part, are writing disinterment memos and trying to get these unknowns out of the ground and identified. The big roadblock is we can get all the approvals that we need to get, but until we reach that 50% threshold, we cannot pursue that disinterment. And when I say that, we're not just waiting around for a family member to hear about us on the local news. We're working with your service casualty officers. They're working, they employ genealogists to go out and try and find family members so that we can reach these thresholds. So it's something that we're actively doing. But until we find, we might even find a family member, but then we find out that, the only family member that we've been able to contact is not a blood relative. We can't count them against the FRS threshold. So the answer to your question is that until we make that point, that disinterment memo will stay in a holding pattern until we break the FRS threshold for it. And in this case, it took about 5 years. But the one other thing I'll point to on that is that we have really optimized our relationship with the service casualty officers. They're having better luck reaching families. They're getting FRS from more families every year. So every year it seems that process is picking up a little bit. Hopefully that remains to be the case going forward.
Okay. And then the second, could you just repeat where we can get our individual deceased personal file?
Yes, so when you had your meeting today, you sat down with the historian and your service casualty officer, talk to your SCO, and they will make sure that you get your IDPF. Yes, ma'am, in the back. Could you repeat that for me, ma'am?
When you were in Papua New Guinea, did you address anything that happened in Simpson Bay Harbor? My uncle was shot down there.
When I was recently in Papua New Guinea, we were there to work with the host nation government. We do since we do so much work in PNG, we have a few times a year where we just get over there to talk to them about making sure that we're coordinating things like logistics for the following year. But I know that during our most recent mission to Papua New Guinea over the summer, we were out in East New Britain in the vicinity of Simpson Harbor. I don't know if specifically, I'd have to double check whether, I don't believe we weren't doing any underwater work there at the time, but we have a lot of air losses in East New Britain from air crews that were attacking Rabaul. And so we do spend a pretty good chunk of our time investigating cases in that vicinity. And the most recent time was earlier this year. Yes, ma'am. Oh, hold on, we get the microphone coming your way. How many missing in Papua New Guinea? By last check, it was about 3,800. Yeah, it's 3,800. It's a pretty good size. There's and we do a lot of work there because we have success. One of the reasons is if you look at it compared to a place like the Philippines, where there is a much greater population in the Philippines. Population means development, development means disturbance. We have more sites, relatively intact sites in a place like PNG, where we can, we have a greater probability of finding remains because nobody has built a house on top of them, or nobody has, in some cases, disturbance helps us. We get a lot of leads in PNG from logging companies who are, go out and are cutting trees, especially in East New Britain. We've gotten a lot of leads from a big logging company out there that has, tells us when they come across aircraft wreckage. So, yeah, that's PNG is we've got a good track record there, and we'll be definitely be going back. I haven't seen it on this side of the room. So.
Are you able to just review the projects that are taking place for World War II in Southeast Asia? There was a list of them that were presented, but I don't recall the actual projects that have been identified.
It's specifically in Southeast Asia, or do you mean the whole Indo-Pacific area?
Well, Southeast Asia, Indo-Pacific.
Yeah. So for project spaces, that's something that we're always working on, and we've really leaned into project spaces where we can better collaborate with one another and share ideas. For Southeast Asia, we have most recently done a recovery operation in Thailand. We have casework in progress for there are a handful of World War II losses in Vietnam, where we already have an existing infrastructure for working on our Vietnam losses. We have a lot of these group presentations we had today, the Cabanatuan POW camp, the hell ships. We have project work on the Philippines, on Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands. A lot of projects come from spaces where we might look at one of your cases. Say we come to an event like this and we have a really interesting and engaging conversation with one of you, and then so what are all of us good little historians going to do? We're like, well, that's cool. That's really interesting. I'm going to go back and look into that. And we're going to look into it anyway. We always follow up on the things that you tell us. But some of the questions that you ask, or some of the questions that we find during research, don't lead to very easy answers. And so what starts as a look for a search into your case, say if it's a bombing loss over Rabaul in Simpson Harbor, a look at that case turns into a project, a Simpson Harbor project, where like, well, we can't really understand this loss or the context or exactly how to go about pursuing it unless we understand the greater collective of what happened out there. How many bombers went down in this area? How many raids were there on this area? What time frame did it all occur in? How much AGRS activity happened there after the war? What have we done there? What have the Japanese done there? So I know it's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but I guess the answer is for project spaces, it's always changing. We're always growing new things, sometimes on our own, sometimes in partnership with other countries, sometimes through our partnerships and innovations directorate. We're always just looking for another way. As I mentioned, I think the first thing that I mentioned is that this is an 80-year-old problem without a solution. So any way that we can think to conceive of this and look at the problem a different way, we're interested in doing. And project spaces have been a really successful way for us.
We'd want the most bang for your buck, right? Or whether it's the largest number of possible solved cases?
Well, that's an interesting question because oh yeah, so the question is kind of like, don't you want more bang for your buck based off of areas that you're going to have more success. So it's kind of a yes or no, because on one hand, we're looking for everybody's family members. And so here, a good example is really, really big thing happened for us in 2024. We started resuming field work in the People's Republic of China. The Chinese let us in. That was a big deal. We were in China about 3 weeks ago doing field work with plans to go back as many times as we can while they still allow us to. There's a lot of circumstances around things like that where access opens to different places, new historical information that we think is really going to be lucrative and help us find remains. Of course, there are some places where we're looking for remains cost less money than going to other places. There are some places where the visa process to get a team into the country is easier than in another place. But we look at the problem in a holistic way. And yes, every year we have to determine where the money from that year is going to go and what we're going to pursue. But it's a continuous process of looking at what we succeeded in doing this year, what didn't work, what's a challenge that we're facing going forward, and the idea is that we are able to consistently look at the problem and think about what is the best way for us to provide closure for as many families as possible across as many spaces as we can. Yes, ma'am. Oh, yeah. Marines are on the way.
Thank you. When you were talking about taking all of these small cemeteries and putting them together, where did this decision come from to put a cemetery in the Philippines or to put a cemetery in Guam or wherever? Because my husband is Filipino, so my kids are Filipino, and my son's very interested in our heritage or his heritage. And while looking online, and he's an online expert, at all different things, he found a plaque in Manila, big plaque, that had my uncle's name on it. Does that mean that he was taken from someplace and brought to Manila? And if they knew who he was and they knew he was from the United States, then why wouldn't they bring him back here?
That's an interesting question, and it's hard for me to comment on specifically that plaque when I'm not familiar with exactly what or where it is. But the answer for all the American remains throughout the world, where if they are remains that were either identified as an American or presumed to be because in order to become an unknown in an American cemetery, usually there's some material evidence or something that tells you that this is likely an American. In a lot of cases, the decision was up to the family at the time. If you look through a lot of IDPFs, you'll actually see a lot of families who, despite all of their grief, despite everything that they're going through, make the decision to say, when the Army or whoever tells them, here are the things that we can do with your loved one's body. In a lot of cases, they say, if he's in the Philippines right now, surrounded by all these other servicemen, keep him there. And that's a decision that the family makes. As I mentioned, that's something that was unique beginning with World War II, where families actually had that much say in what happened to their loved one's remains. So I can't specifically, without knowing a little bit more, I'd be happy to talk to you more about your family member and learn more about specifically what happened to them. But that's how the final disposition of where American remains wound up was determined. I think, am I getting the, yeah. Can I take one more?
Can we wait?
Oh yeah, we've got the big Q&A coming up, so all right. Thank you all so much.
Sorry, I didn't want to cut off Kyle, but we have the other folks are coming back into this room for the final Q&A. So Kyle will be back up here. So if you didn't get to ask him a question, he's coming right back. So if you need to grab a cup of water or hit the bathrooms, hit the head, do so now, because in 5 minutes we're going to start the final Q&A. And that will have everybody from the entire day. If we can get everybody back in the room and shut the door, we'll start the final Q&A. And we're going to have the same setup that we had earlier. We're going to have two microphones, I should say, I think, for the Q&A. We're going to have everybody that has spoken to you today up front. So you can ask any question you want of the folks up front. Same ground rules as earlier, though. If it's case specific, it's about your loved one's loss, just get with us offline, because your question should help everybody in the room. So if you start getting bored into your case or specifics on your case, that's going to be tough for the folks up here to address, and it's also unfair to the folks in the audience. And we can shut those doors. We're going to get two microphones, hopefully. One here and a microphone here. One second, we're just getting one more microphone. There we go.
Do you need a mic up there?
Yeah.
How many?
Perfect. Do we have two? Do we have two mics in the audience for the? Okay. All right. Okay. One here. Okay. Yasmin has one. Ryan has the other. Okay. And we got a first question right here.
So I had a question kind of for the historians. Are there circumstances where you guys have been able to use war records from the Japanese to help locate like crash sites or to help locate places where you conducted an investigation? Like basically, have you used records other than those of the United States? What kind of partnerships have you had with foreign governments and information you've been able to get from them?
I'll start with the is this on?
Yep.
Okay, I'll start with, because you mentioned Japan, and I'll hand it to Don after. But yeah, so mainly as recently as this summer 2023, we did an archival research trip to Japan. So we're really expanding our network of contacts with the Japanese to determine what records are available to us. And towards that, we've actually employed a few more people over the course of the last year who speak and read Japanese, which is of course really useful for something like that. So yes, we're doing a lot of work with the Japanese government, expanding our footprint with them, discovering new ways that we can collaborate, and beyond that, we have, at least in terms of archival research, we have a lot of cooperation with other countries. We research across the Indo-Pacific Directorate and the Europe-Mediterranean Directorate. We research in archival repositories all the time in other countries. Most recently, I can think of Japan, Australia, Solomon Islands. We work closely in China with the People's Liberation Army archives, so we can count that as an archival trip as well. I don't know if John has anything to add for Korean War.
Yeah, I'll give it to Mark for World War II, and then I can cover Korea.
Yeah, thank you. For Europe, we actually use the captured German records. So after the war, we captured the German shoot-down records, and those are actually from anti-aircraft like flak batteries where they would have a flak station and be shooting down our bombers and fighter aircraft, and they would actually plot the location where those were shot down. So those were captured after the war. We have copies of all those in our national archives, and we use those foreign records to pinpoint and to correlate our own wreckage sites that we're looking for as another piece of evidence. I think there are, we have a couple other examples of collaboration with the foreign records and with foreign governments. So, Dawn?
Yeah, so for the Korean War and the Cold War, there's all kinds of different examples. So Kyle already touched on the People's Liberation Army. We've had a relationship with them since the mid-90s in terms of getting records from Korea or them sharing information with us, not always records. We had a huge breakthrough this year that they gave us some Cold War documentation, the People's Liberation Army did. Also, a lot of our research for the Korean War is based on information that China and North Korea gave us through Operation Glory, which was really important for those Korean War families in the room. We also work with a very large collection of captured North Korean documents, so we've just started getting more into that recently and have a targeted project on that we've been working in the National Archives. And then also our partners at Macri have also, that's the South Korean version of the DPAA. They've also been helping us as well. So for Korea, really every aspect we do. And then we also have one Japanese speaker, and so we do have some crossover with Japan. Some of our records are in Japanese, so we also luckily have a Japanese speaker on the team who helps with some of those as well.
Sorry, I think you mentioned partners, and I'll just, on that German shoot-down records, we're supporting the EM researchers with a university that's looking through those, and they bring often language skills. We're pursuing that for IP with Vietnamese language speakers, and so we're trying to find, again, ways that partners can add some additional capability, whether it's foreign language or other skill sets that, and sometimes they're very familiar with the foreign archives because they've been doing their own research there. So we're trying to build off that as well. Thanks for the question. Sorry, Don has more.
More on partners. So our partner at Florida State University, his name is Sungmin Yang. He is a Korean speaker. He's been collecting Korean maps. His entire dissertation was on Korean War newspapers. So just a shout out to Partnerships and Innovations. It's a really, really excellent partnership, and he's doing a great job.
Okay, next question. Yasmin.
So we have a question from our online audience, and someone asked, if a private researcher or historian is looking at an X file and has strong evidence that the X file can most likely be an individual unknown, how would one go about submitting a request for disinterment of that unknown for identification? Who could they email or call?
So since I have the microphone, I'll start with Korea, and then I'll hand it over to some World War II people. So for Korea, for those of you in the room and online, we have a 7-phase plan that was based on historical evidence and scientific evidence that was temporally and operationally driven. So that plan has been in place since 2018, and we're not going outside of that plan. So all of the remains in the punch bowl who are identified as unknowns are going to be disinterred and brought to the laboratory, so we're not going out of cycle. So if there's information that particular researchers have about a specific X file, they can send it to us, but the plan, which is posted on our website, won't change. And I don't know if anyone from World War II wants to jump in there.
I'll just jump in because since we have so many X files from World War II that are not scheduled for disinterment just yet, that are whether they're through various stages of research or FRS collection or anything, anytime that anybody outside of DPAA has information for us, we are always looking, open to any information that the public can offer us, whether it's another historian or a family member, anybody who has information that they think will help us lead to the resolution of a casualty. We're always welcome for that. You can at any point reach out through our website or through your service casualty officer, and that will get, your questions will get to, eventually, if it's a research question, get to me or Dawn or Mark, one of the research branch chiefs, to address that within our teams.
Yeah, if I can follow up on that. If you go to our website, obviously the person has our website and goes to contact us, and there's a menu there. They can submit a question, and the subject would be, I have evidence to submit, and they would click that, and they could send it right in. We'd take a look at it. We've got a question up front here. Wait 1 second, sir. We'll get you a microphone.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Yes, my name is Norman Baker. I'm here for my dad, Lieutenant Donald Baker. He was the ship that he was on in the English Channel, Christmas Eve, 1944, and they were coming over from England, and they were being escorted by a British destroyer. And 5 miles off the coast of Cherbourg, because they have just crossed the English Channel, which doesn't take very long, it's like 100 miles. But they were 5 miles from the coast, and they were hit by a torpedo, and my dad survived the torpedo damage. He was fine. He was on the main deck. He was a young lieutenant, and he was in charge of a group of men, and he was with his roommate in England, and they were both on the main deck, and the ship was sunk and dead in the water, and the captain from the Brilliant, which is a British frigate ship, came alongside and asked them to just, or told them to just jump on board, but the ships were doing this, the sea was rough. And so my father's good friend, he says, let's jump on that destroyer and get off this, because this is sinking. And my dad said he wouldn't leave the ship unless he knew where all his men were. And I have the letter that he sent my mother a year later about what really happened. And it was years before I got any information, because it was all kept very quiet, because the High British Command and Eisenhower decided that this was a major sinking, and that it has to be kept quiet for 50 years. Kind of an odd number. I never heard of such a thing. But 50 years later, in 1994, they finally let it all out. But that's not the reason I brought up the whole subject. I'm seeing it going on. Dr. Bracken's presentation earlier, which was great, he pointed out, he showed a few charts, pie charts, and one of them was the how many people were lost at sea. And my dad, I think, falls into that category. There were only 40 or 50 men left when they sank. I think my dad went down there with it, and it's not that far off the coast. But they're not entombing it. I guess France got involved, and I don't think anyone's allowed down there. So my question is, if there is such a small concentration of men on that ship down there, why can't somehow the U.S. government can't get in there and get convinced that the French that we should be able to go down there and gather what's left? Because a few years ago, I had my DNA done with the U.S. Army, and I'm glad I did, but that's my only hope, that they can find something and come to some result.
Sir, can we get with you individually after this?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll get with you afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
By the way, this is a picture of my dad.
That's a great picture. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions for the group? Right here.
George Perdurzay. First, I want to thank this group for the time they spent today. It's amazing. This is my first meeting, and I'm blown away that you can be up on a muddy hill somewhere the bucket brigade, all the way down to 10 to the 1,000th power statistical significance at the DNA level. That's unbelievable. So my question is, how do you maintain funding? And is there anything we can do as a group to keep this going?
So fortunately, we endeavored about 2017 to do exactly what you're asking, meaning to have our budget increase to a level that we were able to execute, with also an opportunity to hire personnel, right? Because it doesn't matter if you increase our budget if we don't have the people. And so, you know, you saw the staff kind of step back and smile. It's because we went through a rigorous bottom-up review, and I'm just glad they didn't stab me in the back because I also run the budget for the agency. And when we did that bottom-up review, we submitted it to the department's comptroller. They approved it. Last year, we received a $30 million plus up for our operations, as well as if that wasn't enough, as well as funding to hire a lot of historians. So we had authorization to bring on board about 16 historians, which is huge. In addition, we received money to refurbish our vehicles because we have detachments in Southeast Asia specifically. We have another detachment in Germany. We haven't really attacked those vehicles. We're working a contract on those. But for our fleet over in Southeast Asia, we were given 5-year money to replace those fleets. We are still in the hiring process, so we went from about, 70% manning for civilians. The military members, the services have been awesome in making sure that we get backfills for our uniform personnel. But for the civilians, we are responsible for hiring our own. And so we went from about 70% to right now we're at about 95% filled. So in answer to your question, nope, we don't need any help. We have the budget that we can execute. We could never build an agency large enough to get after all of the unaccounted for. And so we're about optimized right now. We still have a few vacancies out there, obviously, because we're not 100%. But we also have, it's not so much represented here, but I remember the days not too long ago, like last year, where there were many people, my senior, up here, right? And so a lot of people in DPAA were eligible, and many of them are today eligible to retire. And so as they rotate out, that's going to cause more vacancies, but we'll hire behind them. That we have not been under any type of hiring freeze because, frankly, we can control that. The department has changed the way they do the hiring because it used to be, for those of you who remember, there was a time when there was a hiring freeze and nobody could hire anybody. Now and so I'm hoping the pendulum is going to stay in that position. But now the department has given all of the agencies the authority to hire the workforce they can afford. And so for us, we are looking at keeping the overhead for civilian personnel at about 30%. We believe that's good because the rest of those dollars go to not just operations, but we have other information technology and facilities and other things that we need to pay for. So, I'm talking long because it is a success story. I challenge you to find a Department of Defense agency that can get did I say $30 million plus up for 5 years, right? And then there's inflation built in there. So we're sitting pretty right now. I'm very proud of the team that helped pull that together. And then you can give another applause to the families in the room as well who wrote letters, had conversations, as well as the veteran service organizations that every summer would go down and march in Washington and go talk to Congress about making sure that DPAA was properly funded. So we're good. Thank you.
Right here, Ron.
That's awesome news that your budget is great. I wanted to ask if there's anything that us families can do to help DPAA, specifically to help our cases keep moving forward. if there's anything else that we can provide you or do to support you in your efforts on our cases.
Well,
Spread the word.
Yes.
I think Kyle kind of touched on this.
I was just going to say, keep coming to these things. These events for us keep getting bigger every year, and that's just wonderful to see more people getting involved, and we get so much traction based off word of mouth. I don't have an unaccounted for family member, but my aunt, who is despite my being an actual historian, was like the family historian, and she ended up finding family members who came to FMUs just by talking to friends and strangers and anybody who would listen about the work that her nephew is doing at DPAA. So word of mouth, it really is the best way to get out word about us.
I think the other thing you can do is, especially you, Kim and Rick and Donna and all of the other long-serving family members, you all definitely keep coming because you can help fertilize this crop, right? Because you have all of the experience that all of these family members are trying to acquire. So being involved, I think, is the strongest advocacy for moving this mission forward and then helping us as well. Talking about FRS, going out in your community, talking to young people. You know, if you have a Boy Scout troop in your community or a Girl Scout troop or a high school that your children attend, you know, participate and be a part of their Veterans Day and talk about this mission set.
I think the only thing I would say is I've told this to a number of families. You heard about one from the PDD today, Kearney. I've known her for 20 years, and difficult case, and I kept telling her, don't lose the faith. Keep the faith. If the science isn't there yet, we will develop it. We will keep going after it. That's our promise. You know, so just keep the faith, I think, is the biggest part, and be advocates for your fellow service members and everything like that, and your fellow families.
Here's an opportunity to talk about the DNA.
Oh, so today we had what we call a must collect. This is an individual who has no references on file yet, and that's what we're looking at. And we had 11 of those, and the gentleman came up and had his son with him, and so I started asking some questions, and I looked at my sheet, and it turns out that he is the paternal nephew. The father is the paternal nephew of the missing service member. So I said, are you the paternal grandnephew of, and the young man said yes, probably 10 years old. So I looked at his dad and I said, you know, I like to have 2 references of each type. Would you be willing, or would he be willing to give a reference? And the kid's, his eyes lit up. He loves science. He loved Dr. Toe's talk. So we may have a budding scientist here. Or a PDD, absolutely. We all, even in my, my humble, I'm trying to get to, that position someday. But we, in the military, there are challenge coins. And so I have a director's coin for DNA. And I gave that to that young gentleman and the young man, and his eyes lit up. And so he is now the next generation that is going to carry this on. And that's what we're looking for, is we don't want to lose that voice of our fallen heroes, right? Every one of them, whether it's all 72,000, all 38,000 recoverable, they are all fallen heroes. And as the PDD says, behind every one of those fallen heroes is a family. And so that's one of the big messages. Keep the faith, pass it on, and be advocates.
And bring your kids and grandkids to the FMU.
They'll each get a coin.
That's right.
Next question, Yasmin.
This is a question about the disinterment threshold. Because you have to have so many references before you can take a body, is there any way to get that reduced? Is that something that is from another country, our country? Like, can we, is this a write your congressman type of deal? Or, just to get more bodies tested?
I'll go ahead, I'll clear there is an effort afoot internal to the department where we are petitioning to be given the authority for my boss to approve disinterments. And so a lot of conversations, a lot of back and forth. You know, I think it was Dr. McMahon that talked about, you know, the two uncles wanting to do the same thing. And so we're trying to work through that. So I guess for that, I would say watch this space. If we get what we want, we won't say that the thresholds will necessarily go away, because we still have to put the rigor in the research, right? But we won't have to answer questions that our scientists have already proven to this leadership, to somebody else external to DPAA that really doesn't understand our mission and doesn't have any expertise on their staff to deal with disinterment. So we're hopeful. Pray for us. Absolutely, Donna.
One thing that we can do as families, if and when it becomes necessary, is to involve our elected officials. My Senator Angus King is standing at the ready to have a congressional hearing or whatever else needs to be done if it doesn't go the way it's supposed to. You know, on the issue, I was just about to say that. As to the disinterment authority issue and so forth. And so keep abreast of everything, and make sure to forget that our senators and our congressmen and women represent us, and keep them informed, and they're ready to help when they can.
That's why I love Donna Knox, right? Because she is always in the right place at the right time, giving the answers that some of us can't go on record.
Right in the back. Sorry.
Thank you. Question earlier on is, what can we all do to help in DPAA's efforts? And one of the things that I thought of, I brought some old documents from World War II. They're sort of the magazines or cruise books, let's say, of one of the units. And I've been helping some elderly people do clean-outs, and I'm closing in on that elderly moniker now myself. And you need to have a bit of history and knowledge, and maybe for the historians, these documents are relevant. You probably have tons of them, but maybe not. So I'm wondering what is the best way to maybe help. And one thing that I think we can all do is document our family stories, and maybe we can help connect some of the dots. And I think today my family, in talking with our, I don't remember the term you used, but the individuals that helped us during our individual session, and maybe we can all provide that missing piece of the puzzle that's been mentioned so many times that will make an unknown or one that we're still searching for found. Thank you.
Yes, sir, you're right. The service casualty officers are probably who you're referring to, and they send us a lot of information from the families yourself that they receive. So if you have information that you want to get to us and you give it to your service casualty officer, they're going to turn around and send it to us. They're going to document it. They'll note that you provided it to them, and then they're going to turn around and send it to us. So that's a great avenue to provide us information.
First of all, thank you. I cannot imagine, and I tell a lot of my friends that I cannot imagine a better spending of our tax dollars than DPAA and ABMC. So thank you a million. Question that I have is, we heard a little bit about a ship that had been torpedoed. Are you looking, or do you see any technology on the horizon that may allow you to search some of these ships that had been torpedoed, or is that a little bit further down the path? Because I know you haven't given up.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the answer is yes and no. And the reason why the answer is yes and no is because a lot of the technologies that we have today that we use for something like an underwater survey of a shipwreck are still tried and true and still are extremely effective. Just because something is I don't want to use the word old, but just because something has been used for quite a while doesn't mean it's bad. So we still use a lot of those techniques that we have been using and have been tested and are good. We also look for new technology to see what we can do, and there's always better resolution of cameras. There's always better resolution of side scan sonar, better resolution of a bathymetric magnetometer, and these are all the techniques and all the methods and all the equipment that we do employ into some of our underwater surveys. This is one of those things that every 5 minutes I look at our PDD and say, can I have a new toy? Can I buy this? Can I buy that? Because it's the same equipment, but the technology is better. The processing on the computer is better, the upgrade on the computer is better, and that way we can get into some crevices. If we're using an underwater UAV, for example, that's too dangerous for people to go into, especially on that shipwreck that I think you're talking about. I described it as those puzzle sticks that when you take the puzzles apart and you pull one stick out, you want to make sure the whole thing doesn't fall. That's actually how that shipwreck is. It's extremely dangerous. So being able to have an ROV or something like a rover or a UAV underwater to get into some of those crevices is really what we're looking at. And it's both technology that's old as well as technology that's brand new because of the constant upgrades of those. So that's a really good question.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I mentioned the principal deputy director and I were just at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, which is one of the leading underwater archaeology remote sensing. So we're absolutely going after advances in underwater archaeology, advances in underwater types of technology that Dr. Toad just mentioned. And again, when you pursue innovation, you have to do it with discipline because there are just, again, Ashita Salud, there's so many things that are going on. So under our director, Major General Retired McKeag, and under the PDD, the agency has set up an innovation program to go about this with discipline, to go after it strategically, to go after it collaboratively. So we interact with our scientific analysis colleagues, we interact with the different regional directorates, and try to bring in outside experts and our own folks to look at the technology, see what has the most potential in the shortest period of time at the most reasonable cost to help us do this in a disciplined way. So yes, we're looking at, and both I think the PD and I were just amazed at what Woods Hole was saying that they're doing, and we had another partner who's pursuing an underwater site in the Philippines, and it's just really cool. Ma'am, did you want to jump on that?
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is, so what's being described really is 2 lines of effort for this piece that you're talking about. One that Dr. Toad talked about is with the current, right, new and old technology, but partnerships and innovations, what we're doing is we're going after the cutting edge so that we can have the ability to have access to technology that we don't have to maintain, we don't have to buy, and we don't have to worry about it being antiquated. And so, having an opportunity to talk to a couple of those partners on this particular trip, I was extremely excited. They've got some really cool, innovative technology that has already been funded by the Navy. And so, right? Go Navy. And we could potentially have access to that. And not only is it, the technology already developed, they have some autonomous underwater vehicles that you just set it and forget it, and it does amazing, really amazing things. So we're trying to stay on the cutting edge and stay ahead as much as possible.
Over here. Yasmin.
Thank you all for being here. It's tremendous work that you do, and it's greatly appreciated by all of us, I'm sure. Several of you spoke about the collaboration that you received from both government and at the individual level, the local level. How difficult, how often do you run into, let's call it resentment, particularly at the local level, when it comes to recovering the remains? I'm thinking in terms probably of Vietnam as the most current, most recent conflict, where there may still be people who have resented the effects of the war on them personally or on their families. Do you find that that is as difficult as it seems like it should be, or are you able to overcome that in other ways? Thank you.
I asked to answer this question because for me personally, the answer is no. I have been regularly amazed at the collaboration that I have felt on the local level, both on the local level and the mid-level. Sometimes you get a little bit higher in level, it gets a little bit political and wacky, but especially on the middle level, at the local level, the villager level, the landowner level, that level for me has been nothing short of amazing. Now, for every country's different. Every country has had different experiences, and it also makes a difference if I'm talking to somebody who was displaced because of the war. They don't live here, they didn't live here before, they had to move from their town, now they live here. They were displaced. Or it makes a difference if I'm talking with people who are actually combatants in the war. But I have found an overwhelming amount of understanding of what we're trying to do. And when I explain it in terms of families, some people definitely look at us, especially Southeast Asia, they'll look at us and our techniques and they think, what are you guys doing? And when we explain, we're trying to bring these remains back to the families. We're trying to, and as an anthropologist, as a forensic anthropologist, one of the phrases that I use is, we are the voice for the dead. The dead can't speak anymore, but as an anthropologist, I speak for the dead. And we want those spirits, a lot of these countries we go to are very spiritual, not necessarily religious, but spiritual. And I say that we want these spirits to rest, and they understand that completely. Their attitude changes completely when I explain that to them. So we've had some family members, some local villagers, and they understand it completely. Even people that may have fought in the war against us, they understand that business is business and war is war, but now is now. And they want to help us. They absolutely want to help you, and they want to bring the remains back to the United States so they can have a proper burial. So I've had only good experiences in the field. But that's personally speaking. I won't speak for everybody else.
Captain, China, right? Did you do the IT? Yeah, so talk about the villages. What was your experience? At least I heard that it was pretty amazing.
Test. Yeah, so I think the best phrase that we use in the field is we're looking for our grandfathers. And just like Dr. Toe said, something clicks when they hear that. The local villagers totally understand it and they get behind it. When we were in China, we were looking for World War II. And it just so happens that we fought alongside the Chinese in that conflict. It was the Flying Tigers. And that's famous to them. It's in their lexicon. Almost all of at least in southern China where we had a foothold, they totally understood it. They supported us. They even erected their own tombstone for the general area. They had a general idea of where this pilot was, and all they wanted to do was help. And then when we were in the northern side of China, even when it was a Cold War loss, a Korean War loss, they still understood. The only pushback, again, was the weird political aspect of it, but the general villager completely understood. Again, when we said we're looking for our grandfather, we just want to bring him home. So total support on that end.
Yeah, that was excellent. I'll pass it to you next, Dawn. And I wanted him to tell that story because, when you listen to the news, you hear perhaps global competition between nations. You might hear rhetoric on both sides. And so that has not impacted our mission set because we are a humanitarian. We're seen as humanitarian. And we do a lot of discussing at the highest level, even before it gets down to putting our soldiers and civilians, military in harm's way in a country. We have international engagement officers that work with embassies, both U.S. and the host nation. And so I will tell you the thing that most concerns us is not necessarily the local level, like the team just described, but anytime there's any type of unrest in a country, that could bleed over, then that's when we get a little concerned, because it's not about being American, it's about just being mad at your country. Go ahead, Don.
Yeah, I'll just add real quick too, like even in China, they renamed the road Heroes Way. So it's something they're actively still thinking about. So Heroes Way, it's named after an American in southern China. So.
And even on cases, just touching back on China, even when we were dealing with the officials, I was speaking with some family members today about this, that high-level officials, grief can be universal. Loss is universal. I think one of the things that we really connected on when we were in China with the officials of the People's Liberation Army, was that we talked about how much the information about a case meant to the children of the missing. And the people we were talking to, yes, they were officials, but they were also parents. And imagine, as many of you have felt this, what it would feel like to not know what had happened to your father. And for those parents on the other side, they want their children to know what happened to them. And I think that really was a point of connection. When we told the story, people on both sides of the table, when we were talking about it, were getting emotional. And I think that the things that we feel in this room and that we feel about this mission truly, truly is universal. Whether you're on the lowest level of government or the highest level of government, grief, loss, family connection is universal.
Great question. I don't think we've ever had that question.
Right here.
Hi, good afternoon. Quick question regarding ground recoveries. Back, oh gosh, I don't know, 15 years ago, ground penetrating radar was just the big buzzword. And now I'm hearing, yeah, I see people walking away. Now I'm hearing that, oh, we don't use that. That only was, a couple times a year where that was successful. So continuing the conversation about technology, has there been any technological advances to replace ground penetrating radar?
There's nothing wrong with ground penetrating radar. GPR is a fantastic medium and a fantastic method, and we'll employ it. We actually just bought the laboratory. We bought a brand new one, and it's less than a year old, and it's wonderful. It's fantastic. But here's the thing about GPR. GPR is not universal. It doesn't work with anything. You think about going to the doctors. My leg hurts, my knee hurts, my head hurts. There are different ways to treat that problem, and there's different ways to treat that issue. You're not going to get a knee replacement if your ear is hurting, and so when it comes to GPR, it's not a universal thing we can use for everything, and so it's very specific to the site and very specific to the case, and is only useful in certain circumstances. And when the data does warrant for us to use it, we absolutely will use it. But when the data doesn't warrant for us to use it, we don't want to use a medium just 'cause. You don't want to have to go get a CAT scan if you don't need one. It is a poor use of resources. It's not good for you, and it wastes time. We could be doing something else. And so we don't want to employ a method that won't further the case. It's not a good use of resources. And so that's one of the reasons why we won't use GPR and everything. So it's not that GPR suddenly went bad. It's just that when a new technology pops up, and GPR is not new, but for any new technology, and it becomes the hottest thing, everybody wants to use it, and sometimes it gets overused. The MRI is a good example of something that most doctors now, if you have lower back pain, are not automatically going to use an MRI. They are not going to, that's not the first thing anymore. It was for a while. That's the first thing that happened when you had back pain, but now they don't. So it's the same thing with GPR, is that if it's seen as the hot new trend, like you said, it may be overused, and that may be a little bit of what happened in the past. We still use it quite a bit, but we only apply it when the case warrants it. As far as new technologies go, there's always new technologies that we're using. We did buy 2 brand new magnetometers that are in fantastic shape, that have new upgraded equipment, and we're always looking for something new. And there's always new developments in research that we have to apply with rigor and validate. Is this new thing that came out, is it actually a really good new thing? Or is it something that sounded like a good idea, but it's not going to pan out? And technologies fall into both categories all the time. Everything that comes up we look at as potential use, and if it's great, we move forward and use it, and if not, we look for something else.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? Do you bring that along on DTFA? Do you bring it along on JTFAs just in case you need it? I mean, because I can't understand how you could make the decision without doing the excavation first.
Right.
And then decide, hey, do we need to use it? Or
Yeah,
should we have
generally-
it handy?
Yeah, that's a good question. Generally, we will not take a ground penetrating radar until we've decided it's warranted beforehand. We don't take it just in case. It's not gigantic, it's about the small size of a small lawnmower, but we know enough about the site and enough about the case to decide whether or not that's warranted. We learned that in advance by doing investigations, archaeological surveys, what we call PDSS, pre-deployment site survey, and we get as much information as we can to warrant the next step. And if we decide that that next step does not include GPR, then we won't take it with us. But if it does, we certainly will take it with us.
Good question down here. Wait, Rick, one second. Wait for a mic.
Hi, if I can take a moment, whether you like it or not. I've got the microphone. We've been here a long time, and I would like to just make an appeal as one family member to another. It's been mentioned here about what can we do, and my sister Donna and I have just amazing what we can do if we decide we want to do it. And advocacy, some of us have the advocacy gene and some don't. You know, just those of you are here because you are advocating for your missing loved one. And, but they need more, and we all need more in the higher levels of policy of government, our own especially. And that any kind of relationship, it was mentioned about your own congressman and woman, your senators, your local offices, the staffers are just waiting to hear from you. And reach out and get them to know your case. Get them to know your case and the fact that it is linked to all other cases. The issue is much bigger than any one of our missing loved ones. They're not going to be here just to look for my dad, our dad. They're here because there are many of us, and we all have a voice. But we have to say that individually. And there's legislation out there, the Bring Our Heroes Home Act, covers World War II forward, trying to declassify documents that are still classified after all these years, just because people don't get to it. That there's a lot that can be done. And then a personal request I have. At the turn of administration, the new administration does a policy review of policy, and beyond DOD, it's at the national security level and State Department. What is going to be the new policy towards North Korea, for example? And that's the critical point right now, because so many of the North Korean families members are missing inside North Korea, and you all know those relationships between the U.S. and the DPRK. If you can strike up this relationship, mention to your congressional representative that in this policy review, we'd like our own government to handle this issue separately from all the other contentious issues that go on between these two governments. That would help create that policy that might improve relations, at least from our side, which would be good. And I would appreciate that. And anything, those of you who have the advocacy gene, light it up and put it to work. And again, thank you all. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you, Rick. Ma'am, should we close on that? I think we're going to close on that, and I'm going to dismiss the panel. You can give them a round of applause. And I'm going to turn it over to the Principal Deputy Director. But before I do, I just want to thank all the folks in the background. There's a lot of folks running around that were not in this ballroom that did a lot today. And, a lot of them, the service casualty officers do amazing work, and Greg Hayes and his team out in the foyer. So it's not everybody in this room. So all those other folks, thank you. And ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So again, thank you so much for spending your Saturday with us. I hope that you learned a lot. I hope you're overwhelmed, because that means you have plenty of information to take home, to take your time to digest until we meet again, hopefully not 9 years later. Perhaps we will be conducting a family member update in an area that you can travel to from here. In addition, if you are a Vietnam War family member or a Korean Cold War family member, please talk to your service casualty officer about our annual government briefings and find out about when those are held, how they're funded, so that we can see you again in Washington, D.C. Come down and we'll have more conversations. Those two meetings are a little bit different than this one. We often have foreign officials that attend, as well as U.S. government officials that will talk to you about what their portion of the what their organizations are doing for you, not for DPAA, but for you. And then lastly, thank you so much, family member back there that held up his questionnaire. That is your ticket out of this room. I have people stationed at the door. No, I'm just kidding. Please, please, please fill out your questionnaire. I really do read them all. And this FMU has been conducted just like it has because of the feedback from you all. You know, there's no greater pleasure for me than when I hear longstanding family members who have come to, I was going to say hundreds, but that might be offensive, come to many of these gatherings. Rick Downs is awesome. Come to many of these family member updates. And this isn't about entertaining, because we're not here to entertain you, but we're here to inform you and to give you insight into what we are doing to account for your loved ones. So with that, I'm going to close. And please don't forget, if you if you realize, oh my goodness, I forgot to stop by the table to check my FRS, I'm sure they're still out there. They can still get you a sample. If at some point at a later date, especially if you were told that you are not a viable FRS candidate, if you come across other family members who you believe might be, please get in contact with your service casualty officer so that they can run the genealogy and find out whether or not they need to send that relative a family reference sample kit. That's all I have. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful and safe trip home. Thank you.